My own background is primarily in social science and mental health research. Those are my own research areas. And I think research ethics is predominantly in the fields of social science and medical research, of course, because of the focus on people. But I've also been involved, and still am quite heavily involved, in the protection of contributors in broadcast, working with Ofcom. But I think that the principles behind ethics of research in these two areas is applicable much more widely. And when we're doing training at the Open University, which we bring students and trainee researchers from all disciplines into our research ethics training, sometimes technologists will say, well, it's got nothing to do with me. And it doesn't take all that long actually to show them that people are involved and influenced by their work. So I hope these principles that I'm talking about can be considered much more wide, that I will be talking about, will be considered much more widely than just these two areas. I put a series of logos at the bottom of the screen there because these are organizations and a project that I'm particularly affiliated with, and I'll make reference to these as I go through. Obviously, I don't need to reference UK RIA because that's our current host today. More recently, my own work, as Davis has as well, has been framed much more in terms of COVID. I've been working with the NHS on the ethics of triage for ITU. That was a very challenging and also, I must say, emotionally charged piece of work. I'm also currently involved in looking at ethics issues in the possibility of electronic, let's call them immunity passports. So there are problems with each of those words, as I'm sure you'll realize. But an interesting issue there related to what Davis said about the relaxation of access to health data in particular, the problems with the test and trace apps around data privacy and participant concerns. And what I'm looking at in this particular work is the ethics cost benefits, if you like, between centralized versus local systems. What I've appealed to in both of those pieces of work is something I think David was talking about, didn't actually use these terms, which is distributive justice, which is moving beyond a focus on the individual to the interests of society as well. So what I wanted to just flag up, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, is that in recent years, both ethics and integrity have become much more to the fore in research. And I think that's particularly evident in the Concordat on research integrity, which includes ethics, doesn't actually give much detail about to implement an ethical process within research organizations. But ethics is not the same as integrity. Ethics is also about doing good in the world. Integrity is much more about honesty and trustworthiness in research. And there is a big area of overlap between the two. But both of these areas have expanded tremendously in recent years. And I'm going to talk particularly about ethics, because ethics is always in flux, because ethics are a social construction. They're, if you like, moral memes that are transmitted from generation to generation. So they're contextual, they depend on the cultural context, and they also have an historical flow. So they're fluid. We like to think sometimes that there's some benchmark, some fixed point, but we have to realize that there's a tension between that idea of absolute standards and relative standards, which are the social construction. Paying attention to the relative standards for ethics is a democratic approach. So that is in opposition to an autocratic morality, if you like, which is the top-down appeal to absolute standards. There's also an issue, which I think is coming out particularly in COVID, in relation to the extent to which individuals feel they prepare to comply with top-down government diktats, which is about human rights and human guidance really from governments versus standards from popular culture. So clearly when people flock to beaches, that's popular culture adopting very different standards. I won't mention other people that contravene guidelines. So we've always got an issue then between codes of ethics, which seek to set out these absolute standards, in a sense, versus our participants' values and attitudes. And I'm very much in favor of the core principle that David set out, which is respect for participants. Indeed, I'm the lead for the BPS Code of Human Research Ethics, and we put respect as principle number one. So, bit of history. The origin of research ethics is most definitely in medical ethics: do no harm to the patient. That actually assumed a rather passive role for the patient, and indeed a patient is often somewhat passive in medical treatment, although we could go further, medical research, although we could go further with that point, but not here. But we've moved now to the idea of participation, which gives much more autonomy and agency to the participant, but still very much focused on that very individual sense of who is the focus of our interest. In social research, we now need to think much more now about the impact on a family of doing research with a participant. We often need to think about extended family, colleagues of the participant, and to think more widely about institutions, about the impact on communities, and indeed on societies. And I wanted to say briefly something about the new digital world, because this has brought about lots of changes. I really don't have time to go into all of those, but just three in particular I wanted to mention is that participants now have online identities. Some of them have avatars, and these aren't necessarily exactly the same as the participant themselves. And what's our duty of care, for example, towards an avatar in an online world? In terms of extended family and colleagues, we now have people with massive online, in quotes, friendship networks. What is our responsibility towards that network? And then right at the bottom, I've added beyond institutions, community and society, which is really restricting our concerns just to the human world. Interestingly, more discussion now about concern for the environment. So this is a big change. These are big changes in the interests we have to take into account. And indeed, this is reflected in the ESRC statement around the development of research ethics in the most recent framework for research ethics. So I thought my timer had started and it hasn't. I just need to check where I'm at. That's fine. Yep, I know where I'm going. So fixed codes struggle to keep up with these changes. And what are the solutions? Well, living documents, and that's often spoken more than it's respected in action. And I think the challenge of keeping living documents alive on the web is a big one, and one that's not been totally solved. Another solution is to have actually principles which can guide action rather than very detailed specifications of how you should behave. And these need to be spelled out in terms of values, because that helps helps researchers to direct their actions. I'll talk more about values in a minute. And to try and define explicit standards, which will vary very much from discipline to discipline. But all of these really should be focused on something that David flagged up, which is to inculcate the requisite values in researchers. Research ethics committees do what they can, but ultimately responsibility sits with researchers, and we should never take that responsibility away. Now, it was promised by David, and I'm going to deliver on the theory behind virtue ethics. We go back to the Greeks, often very helpful, and this respects the history of research ethics, because Aristotle talked about living a good life. He wasn't talking about living a happy life, actually. He was talking about living a good life. And he talked about the principle of eudaimonia, which was not necessarily living a happy life, but living a morally sound life. And he talked about this in terms of a whole series of virtues, which he spelt out. And actually, going back to a question that was put to David, he talked about spheres of action as well as virtuous feeling. So he made this very close link between a virtue and the behavior that follows. So there's no point in me going through all of these. It would take hours to do so. But the two that I think are particularly important for research are fear and confidence. David's already said that courage is very important. You shouldn't be rash in your research, nor should you be cowardly. But I think self-expression is also important in terms of trust and in terms of integrity. If you go down to look at self-expression, Aristotle said that the mean of that, the central value, which is not being excessive or deficient in this virtue, is to be truthful in how you express yourself, the things you say, how you describe your research to your participants. So you don't boast about your research, and nor do you understate it. So they need to get a sense of what the importance of the research is and why they should be involved. So this virtue framework has been applied, particularly by Macfarlane, to the research phases. Again, picking up on David's point, that there are different phases of research, and ethics apply through the whole process of research. And Macfarlane looked at particularly framing research, and again, David talked about the courageousness there. Let's pick up on something else. This virtue that Aristotle talked about, self-expression, is to the fore in disseminating. And again, you have some findings. Should you over-egg them? Should you say that they're absolutely groundbreaking if they aren't really? You need a degree of humility. But at the same time, you shouldn't be timid. If you found something that really is important, you should really be courageous and take it forward, but in a humble way, not over-egging it. Again, I find this a very useful table because it does point to the fact that different ethical issues are salient at different phases in the research process. And David has eloquently made the point that ethics review is really only one part of this whole ethical flow through the research phases. It's at the negotiating phase where the researcher is getting everything in place to start their research. What is the role of the Research Ethics Committee then in supporting all of these phases in the research process? Well, at our university, we actually get involved in advising researchers at the framing stage. We get involved in educating. We involved in researchers reporting back when they've created their research. We deal with critical incidents, advice review, and we do, to some extent, audit the ethics of research. And I think this stretches us. It's really difficult. I think one needs to talk about what is the role of the institution in supporting all of these elements of the cycle. And I think also David talked about the virtuous researcher just not emerging. Well, Aristotle talked about actually eudaimonia, a good life, coming about by living with virtuous people. So there's a reference here really to the need for an ethical community being established in universities and research organizations. But in the British Psychological Society, we've taken this quite seriously, and you'll find on the web, there's quite a lengthy document that we've worked up a graded curriculum for psychologists in developing their ethicality. And we've used a framework from James Rest. I think my time is coming to an end, which is 4 components. They're hierarchical and dependent. So the first thing a researcher needs is to be sensitive, simply sensitive to what the ethics issues are. And you can inculcate that by the use of case studies and pointing out and elaborating ethics issues in an interactive way with researchers. The next one is about the capacity to reason ethically. which often is about cost-benefit analysis, but using those ethical principles and values to develop appropriate actions. The next level, once you're able to be sensitive and to reason, is to be motivated to actually put these into practice. And finally, to have the will to implement them and follow them through. I'm giving you the reference for that. Interestingly, I think that different virtues, Aristotelian virtues, apply to these different levels of ethical practice. And I won't spend too much time going through these, but I think the implementation side is important, that one at the bottom, which is to be resolute. It's quite hard sometimes as ethics issues arise in the course of research to navigate them. And it takes resolute behavior. You don't recklessly pursue your protocols if they need to be adapted. James flagged up this new guidance from UK Rio and ARMA. It's also a case study in ProRes, which is an EU-funded project in progress, where I'm a member of this project, and we're developing what we hope will be a go-to site for resources on research ethics and integrity, particularly around these latter phases of research around dissemination. And a final plug is for an Emerald book series that both David and I have been very closely involved in, which goes into all the things we've been talking about in far more detail. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. That was really informative. And it's interesting how the things you brought up also tied in with the different types of topics that David was discussing. How it's interesting to see how everything fits together. Ethics, how it's always the individual themes are parts of a much larger whole. Okay, I've had a couple of questions already. The first from Fiona. In terms of audit, what approach have you and REC colleagues taken? Is it based on risk, general sampling, or some other means?
I think the first and important thing that we've done is to encourage our researchers to trust us. And we do that, first of all, by being very open to informal discussions prior to a formal application being made to the committee. And we promulgate that through the whole university, through our Associate Dean's research, and really encourage it. And individual members of our REC reach out to our individual faculties in this respect. Once that trust is established, it means that researchers are much more prepared to come to us if issues arise during the course of their research. And indeed, that does happen. Critical incidents do arise. And although obviously we hope through our education training to help researchers to deal with those themselves as they arise, we're very open to them coming to us. We also require an end of project report, only on the ethics issues, picking up on David's point. We're not a governance body, or rather we're only one part of governance. There are many other processes within the university to govern research as it progresses, but those are really the two things that we do. We encourage researchers to come to us at any point, and we ask them to review and reflect on the progress of their research in ethics terms. Sorry, second point, James, you were going to come to me with, I think, second question.
That was it basically.
All right.
Okay. So, I should say we've got about 15 minutes of questions, so please do keep them coming. The turn here today has been great. We've had over 300 people attending. Okay, the next question is from Richard. Now, there was a VTI and UK Rio and UK Reproducibility Network study on the drivers of research integrity, published in June, and it considered the role of ethics committees in supporting a culture of research integrity. Some stakeholders suggested in that report that ethical approval processes and research ethics audits could be extended to become broader checks on research integrity. Now, given comments that you've made on keeping a sort of tight scope on ethics review, what's your view on that suggestion?
Well, I think I made it quite clear right at the beginning of my talk. The first main slide is that you can't actually separate ethics and integrity totally. There are areas of ethics research ethics that are matters of research integrity. And I think David pointed to one key one, which is methodology. Rubbish methods lead to rubbish findings and basically fake news. So that's ethical.
Yeah.
That falls within our remit. I think, well, there's been a debate for years, actually, whether regs should look at methods or not. And David has nuanced it well, and I'll support that there are aspects of methods that involve matters of ethics. Integrity in research also involves matters of truthfulness and honesty. That's what I put into my first slide as well. And to an extent, I guess what David was talking about, when you like to see the researcher, you like to get a feel for the way they're approaching their research, is something about, are they basically honest and truthful people? And I suppose underlying that has to be the assumption that some researchers aren't. And we sometimes have to be we tend to pussyfoot perhaps too much around this issue, that there are researchers out there who are dishonest. And actually, it's in my mind today because yesterday I received an email which was an alert about an unethical researcher. And I'm still pondering quite what I should do with that. And I think all I'm saying is that these boundaries are very blurred. And hopefully, within a research organization, there is very good communication between the various arms of governance and the ethics committee, the chair, and members of the ethics committee, because they will always be embedded in the research culture in a university. My own experience, and I think it's been shared by chairs of other research ethics committees, is that often questions of integrity and ethics, which are not the sorts of things that we normally look at, which is protection of participants and communities and families and so forth, but other integrity issues come to the REC. And I think there's a need for universities and other research organizations to take these broader issues of ethics and integrity more seriously and think about how they can formally have channels and processes to deal with them.
I think that's very important. I mean, I know at UKRIA we advise that ethics and integrity should never sort of sit in separate silos, and the systems process, and particularly the people, need to talk to each other. I think situations have improved in recent years. Okay, a question from Gail. Would you suggest that REC advisors doing sort of early involvement of REC advisors in projects can be useful things, such as, you know, a patient or public involvement representative, for example, or, you know, would that be sort of, if you had sort of patient or public involvement representatives, would they also sort of take a REC representative role as well, or would that be sort of an additional thing?
What I would have liked to expand on in my, I think, the sort of second set of slides, where I was expanding beyond the participant model, was I wanted to put in something about co-researcher. I wanted to go from participant to co-researcher, because co-researching, I think, is the future. And the early design, I mean, the NHS actually now looks to, NIHR looks to service user involvement or patient involvement right from the very first phases of research. In fact, I'm involved in developing an NIHR bid, where the first thing we're looking at is working with service user groups to discuss our research questions with them. In terms of the ethics committee, certainly we've always sought to have that sort of representation in our committee, and where it doesn't exist for a particular research project, very specialist one, we would seek to bring that in. But I wholeheartedly support that as a direction of travel. I mean, I don't think we've reached the end of the development of our understanding of research ethics. I think we've got a long way to go. And that idea of co-researching, I think, is going to be a strong direction of travel.
Sure. Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay. Just want to check I wasn't muted. Okay, a question from Omran. It's a very broad question, very important one. How does ethics come into play in terms of research which that doesn't involve people as part of data collection? So when you have research projects that don't have human participants, I have to say that co-research is a term we may have moving towards, but I'm very glad that we don't say human subjects anymore. Participants is a much better term, and I think changing terminology does matter and does have real world effects. But how does ethics come into play when your research doesn't involve human subjects, which is very common in some disciplines of research?
I think it's very rarely that if you dig a little bit, you find that there's a human impact of the research. I've got a case study that I use in our training, which is around the development of what looks like a really useful piece of kit, which is a development of the panic button in care homes, where the panic button has a little video camera and microphone built into it, and it samples video and sound regularly through the day. The idea is, yeah, it would be great in care homes, but the actual project is put forward by a technical company, and they just want to pilot the technical aspects of this data logging. And this is based on actually a real research project, which would not necessarily come to a research ethics committee. I'll give you another troubling example, which I have to be very careful to anonymize. A mathematician who has developed an algorithm for detecting the future gatherings of people based on Facebook data. The mathematician is just developing an algorithm. That's all they're doing. I think, you know, I use examples there, and because it's a question of just digging to see what is the ultimate aim of this research, what is the impact on people.
So it's not just about whether people involved in the data collection, it's the outcome of that. So even something like, say, I know, materials science, it's the real world implications of what might come at the end of your research project.
Actually, yes, and can I just talk very, very topical? If, well, an app is developed to hold a person's COVID test results, how might someone misuse that? Now, just developing an app, okay, there's lots of technical things around that, and be data protection issues and so forth, but what about the misuse of that app? Should we be looking at that?
Thank you very much. I think the questions of use, misuse, impact, and how your individual piece of research fits into larger endeavours and might then be further used with impact on human populations is very important. Okay, right, we've had a slew of questions coming in. We've got 3 minutes to go. So, okay, from Jennifer, to what extent can a participant be a co-applicant in the eyes of the funder? So I think as co-applicant, yeah.
Well, if the that's I can't see necessarily an issue in that. I think if there's a co-applicant, they actually carry a responsibility for the conduct of the research, which would include ethics and integrity, of course, amongst many other things as well. I'm not quite sure where that question is going.
I think if Jennifer, if you can expand on that question a bit, we can come back to it later. Okay, so a question about virtue ethics. To play devil's advocate, might participants be more reassured that by a utilitarian consequentialist approach rather than one of virtue ethics? Can we take any elements from these approaches? Is there a particular reason to champion virtue ethics within the context of research, as there are very strong sort of voices and arguments for consequentialist approaches within applied ethics?
They're not in conflict. They're not in conflict. A virtuous researcher will apply consequentialist thinking. It would be part of the ethical reasoning that I put out in that I set out in the second level of the REST framework. That they aren't in conflict. I'm sure that James would. Sorry, that David. Well, probably you, James, as well. But I'm sure David would agree with me. They're often put in opposition, and also the deontological approach is not out of sync with some elements of virtue ethics. I think what's crucial about virtue ethics is that it puts the responsibility of the researcher at the center of the frame, and the researcher can't escape by saying, well, I followed the code, the detailed guidance, because we have this saying in the British Psychological Society, thinking is not optional, which is you have to always be thinking and reasoning about ethics. Yep, okay.
No, I'd agree, and I think in terms of good research practices as well, that you can't just blindly follow rules, and you should always be self-reflecting. And that point about the research being at the centre also ties in to broader questions about responsibilities of researchers for meeting good practice standards. One final question. Ned asked, we've had a lot of queries to our REC recently about patient-public involvement and whether their recruitment involvement is regulated by RECs. Are you aware of any guidance on that issue? So patient-public involvement and guidance on that.
A patient, again, I'm not quite clear what the question is asking.
Okay, well, Ned, what we'll do is we'll follow, if you can perhaps expand on that question in the Q&A stream, we can try and follow that at the end of the session.
Can I just give an anecdote from personal experience to complete?
Yeah, very quickly.
It's around the question of trust. I was doing ethnographic research in Kyrgyzstan 2 years ago, and I was visiting nomad families on the steppe. I had in Russian, which is one of the languages they speak, patient information for sheets, PISs. I had consent forms that had been translated into Russian, back translated, make sure they were okay, tested out with some people in Bishkek, the capital, all okay. When I met the nomadic people, they weren't interested in that. They certainly weren't going to sign anything. They wanted to know what house I lived in. Would I have a pension? How many children did I have? What was my car? And luckily, I knew from my work with Roma in Central Europe that this would be where I'd be at, talking with people. So I had photographs of my house, my family, and my car. And basically, they wanted to know, could they trust me? If they trusted me, then they were happy to go along with the research.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Pam, for the rest of your thoughts today. Brilliant.